Ratcliffe. He has been awarded with a PhD in philosophy, in history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. And then he taught in several institutions, including Durham University, the University of Vienna, and is now professor at the York University. His research areas are very interesting because the work of a Professor Ratcliffe cover not just phenomenology and philosophy of mind, but also philosophy of medicine and health. In his work, which has an interdisciplinary nature, he applies the phenomenological methodology or applies phenomenological research to topics that typically are studied in psychiatry. So he addresses abnormal experiences that are usually associated with a diagnosis of mental illnesses, such as depression, schizophrenia, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So his work is of particular interest, not just for philosophers, but also for those that work in psychiatry and psychology. Currently, he is working on a project on the nature of grief, but he has done extensive work on the structure of emotional experience, interpersonal and social dimensions of emotion regulation, the phenomenology of linguistic thought, which is a topic that I personally have a great interest in, the experience of possibility, in a way related to the topic that he will discuss today, and the relationship between traumatic events and psychiatric illnesses. He has his numerous publications also include monographies, and 4 monographies in particular. The last one, Real Hallucinations, that I highly advise you to read, is the one I'm most familiar with among his works, and is extremely interesting. He also published Rethinking Common Sense Psychology, Feeling of Being, and Experiences of Depression. Professor Ratcliffe, we are very pleased to have you here today in our lecture series. And today, I think you are going to share with us one of your most recent research works. So we are looking forward to listen to your talk today. Welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for that nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be able to share ideas with you all today. So the paper I'm going to talk through now, this is my first attempt at it. So this is something completely new. What I'm going to try and do is sketch a phenomenological account of what I'm going to call having certainty. And having certainty is to be distinguished from being certain about anything in particular. And the background to this really is that for many years, as you've just heard, I've been interested in various anomalous forms of human experience, disturbances of human experience associated with the likes of psychiatric illness, grief, and upheaval. And in many of these contexts, people describe a shattering of something that they took for granted, something that's often but not always referred to in terms of certainty. So the paper I'm going to present today is just another step in my attempts to articulate this. And what I'm going to do is try to identify a specific aspect of what it is to have certainty in mundane circumstances. And it's going to sound perhaps initially paradoxical, because what I want to suggest to you is that to have certainty is most centrally to have a pre-reflective acceptance of uncertainty, or a certain kind of uncertainty. To have certainty is to possess a certain way, manner, or style of engaging with uncertainty. And when I think about these kinds of issues, I tend to sort of enter into dialogue with various phenomenologists, but today I'm going to focus on the later Wittgenstein. and in particular some of the themes in Philosophical Investigations, and then in the notes published as Uncertainty. And I should confess, I'm not a Wittgenstein scholar, and when I read Wittgenstein, it's like the linguistic equivalent for me of trying to get an eel into a jar, and after a while it does something strange to my brain. So I'm not entirely confident of this interpretation. I may have identified something that is there in Wittgenstein, something that is not there at all in Wittgenstein, or most likely something that is in a hazy in-between zone between being there and not being there. However, whatever the case, I've found it informative to engage with Wittgenstein's work, and I find it a helpful way of trying to articulate something that is otherwise very elusive and challenging philosophically to get a grasp on at all. Then towards the end, I'm going to briefly supplement my account by just mentioning what I take to be compatible themes in the phenomenological tradition, and more specifically in the works of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Then at the very end, I'm going to indicate only briefly how this account of having certainty can help us to better understand, to conceptualize a range of qualitatively different experiences that can arise, all of which can be characterized in terms of disturbances of certainty. Now, in mentioning Wittgenstein and certainty, you might think the natural place to turn is to the concept of a hinge in those final notes that appear as uncertainty, something that's sometimes referred to as a hinge proposition. And familiar examples of these hinge certainties include the likes of, I have two hands, the earth has existed for a long time, and there are other people. And let me just start sharing the screen at this point, and hopefully this will work. Now, the common theme is that whatever these statements articulate is implicit in some context of practice, and within that context, and perhaps more generally as well, it can't be intelligibly doubted. However, there's all sorts of debate about how hinges are to be conceived of. Perhaps they're sort of deeply held or entrenched propositions of some kind. Maybe if you read Daniel Moyle-Sharrock, you'll think they're not propositions at all, they're grammatical rules. Maybe they're non-conceptual practical attitudes, maybe they're beliefs, but that depends on how we conceptualize belief, which is itself a fairly slippery notion. Thankfully, for current purposes, we can remain agnostic over the specific nature, scope, and variety of hinges. I do have a view here, but I can sit on the fence, and that's what I'll do. And the reason for that is I'm increasingly doubtful that Wittgenstein's conception of certainty is exhausted by hinge certainty. And what I want to do here is to address something different, something that I think is at play in his work, but obscured by an overemphasis on hinges. Now, whatever hinges might be, when we're pushed to articulate them, we tend to do so in terms of propositions with different contents. Most famously, this is a hand. Now, even if we accept that Wittgensteinian hinges are not themselves propositional in nature, references to different contents when we articulate them are at least suggestive of there being different hinge certainties at work in different contexts of practice. Whatever we're doing, we're identifying different hinges, and we're doing so in terms of different contents. However, in addressing certainty, I think Wittgenstein is also seeking to articulate something else. A sort of, for want of a better way of putting it, non-localized, pre-reflective, practical confidence. And it's this that I'll refer to as having certainty. And certainty of this kind is singular in nature. It's a precondition, I want to suggest, for our being able to accept anything as a hinge. The most basic form of certainty, if you like, is what's required for the having of hinges. And this distinction between hinges and what's presupposed by the ability to have a hinge, I think it's suggested by some of Wittgenstein's remarks in Uncertainty, But to approach this and to better appreciate what it is to have certainty, I think it's helpful to start from some of his well-known remarks on rule following in philosophical investigations. Now, at several points in philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein repeats the sentence, "Now I can go on." This keeps coming up time and time again. For example, on your overhead here, he finds the series 4, 6, 8, 10 and says, "Now I can go on." And the problem Wittgenstein seems to be getting at here concerns the grounds we have for following 10 with the number 12, rather than with a different number, or for that matter, with anything else. I could flap my hands and sing a song. What makes that wrong and what makes 12 right? Now, in seeking norms that guide and specify our practice in a determinate way and don't just themselves depend on yet further norms, it seems we eventually arrive at the daunting prospect that nothing tells us how to go on. And of course, Saul Kripke famously sets out this problem in terms of a regress of rules, which can only end in activities unconstrained by norms. We just somehow or other, we just do. And for Kripke, and I think this at least is right, it's not just an epistemic problem. Without norms to specify what ought to follow P in any instance of P, there can be no fact of the matter over whether we mean P or Q, and consequently no way of meaning anything. Now, I think there's a lot of controversy over Kripke's interpretation of the problem, but I'm going to assume for current purposes that something like this is broadly right. And if so, there's a temptation to construe it as a purely theoretical problem, one that only puzzles philosophers with a certain disposition and leaves everyone else shaking their head in despair, wondering what on earth these philosophers are going on about. Indeed, Kripke himself writes confidently that this holds no terror in our daily lives. In fact, I think it does. And I want to maintain that what Wittgenstein identifies is in fact a commonplace source of anxiety, disorientation, distress, and in fact terror. And by recognizing this, we can better understand what it is to have certainty. Now, the first question to ask is, if we want to understand "now I can go on," what is it properly contrasted with? What is it not to be able to go on? What is it to be unable to go on in the relevant sense? And I don't think it's a matter of musing over how one could mean P rather than Q or plus rather than quas or whatever. Instead, I think we need to turn to the "I can't go on" of grief, trauma, upheaval, psychiatric illness, and cases of serious bodily illness. Just to give you one example, let's turn to what the phenomenologist and psychiatrist Wolfgang Blankenberg refers to as a loss of natural self-evidence or common sense. The German term is Verlust der natürlichen Selbstverständlichkeit, which is a bit of a mouthful. And the predicament that he's trying to convey involves a diminished or absent grasp of what comes next, what will come next, and what ought to follow and what ought to be done next. And this isn't something that's limited to certain situations. Instead, it envelops all aspects of experience and practice. With the loss of natural self-evidence, what's missing is something singular, primitive, pervasive, and fundamental to living a human life. So here's Blankenberg quoting the account of one patient, trying to describe what it is to lose this basic grasp. Every person knows how to behave, to take a direction, to think something specific. The person's taking actions, humanity, ability to socialize. All these involve rules that the person follows. But I'm not able to recognize what these rules are. I'm missing the basics. It just doesn't work for me. Each thing builds on the next. I don't know what to call this. It's not knowledge. Every child knows these things. It's the kind of thing you just get naturally. And if you look at the rest of Blankenberg's discussion, you see how this Verlust encompasses a sense of what we should do next, what we should say next, what's going to happen next. And it even envelops one's sense of linguistic meaning, as if one's words are defamiliarized, strangely disconnected from their usual contexts of use. And this might seem like a far cry from worrying about the grounding for mathematical rules. However, the common theme is that when we seek a normative basis for carrying on in one way rather than another, in any aspect of our lives, we find nothing. And this applies to all norm-governed practices, to saying and to doing. Furthermore, and importantly, Blankenberg's descriptions, and many others I could draw upon, suggest that the problem identified by Wittgenstein is not just one that can be discovered and contemplated philosophically, it's one that can be lived. Now, according to Blankenberg, a loss of natural self-evidence is indicative specifically of schizophrenia. However, even if it turns out that certain specific phenomenological disturbances are reliably associated with a certain psychiatric diagnosis like schizophrenia, I think a host of different conditions and situations can involve not being able to go on in the relevant sense. We can find this in first-person accounts of grief, trauma, depression, cultural upheaval, and a range of other contexts. So, if that's right, then, both theory and practice presuppose something elusive, something that only operates effectively insofar as it doesn't become an explicit object of scrutiny. And my next question is, how, if at all, can Wittgenstein help us to better understand its nature? Well, at several different points in philosophical investigations, he touches upon and keeps returning to something seemingly paradoxical, something that's there, but not there. And he refers to this in terms of grasping something in a flash, these moments of insight, these eureka moments. So when we grasp something in a flash, there's a phenomenologically discernible transition from not grasping it to grasping it. But the difference, as I think he rightly recognizes, is elusive, because grasping something in a flash doesn't involve it instantaneously appearing in its entirety, like a genie that one has just summoned. As Wittgenstein says, if we appeal to a special experience or mysterious feeling, it doesn't help us at all, at least not without further qualification. That said, I don't think we should regard that as a dismissal of all attempts at phenomenological clarification. Instead, I think we can interpret Wittgenstein as telling us where to look, and he does so by emphasizing anticipation, and more specifically, the manner in which anticipation incorporates indeterminacy or uncertainty. So he's got this nice example, which is quite familiar, I think, to all of us. Consider when we suddenly remember a tune. We can't remember a tune and then suddenly we grasp it. What does he say here? Well, I want to remember a tune and it escapes me. Suddenly I say, now I know it, or if you like, now I can go on. And I start singing it. But what was it like to suddenly know it? Surely, he says, it can't have occurred to me in its entirety in that moment. So what's the difference? What does this grasping consist of? Well, it's neither a matter of not knowing P, nor of suddenly having a complete grasp of P. What's changed with now I know it, and more broadly, now I know how to go on, is the acquisition of a kind of practical confidence. What we found is a path to follow. But although we found a path, the route isn't immediately set out in its entirety. What we have is a confidence that we can follow that route. And I think this could indeed be characterized as a kind of feeling, albeit one that consists in a dynamic, indeterminate, anticipatory structure, rather than a weird momentary quale. So now I know it involves a different form of anticipating. As Wittgenstein remarks later, grasping something in a flash only seems astonishing when we're led to think that the future development must in some way already be present in the act of grasping the use, and yet is not present. So he realizes that now I know how to go on is compatible with being mistaken or later becoming lost. We can set out confidently on a path and then find ourselves stuck all the same. So I think the confidence expressed by now I can go on should be construed in terms of a kind of attitude or orientation towards what's coming. And this same way of anticipating things can encompass spoken language, linguistic thought, bodily activities, and the anticipation of events in our surroundings. And what that means then is that the problem Wittgenstein is eventually hitting on here is not limited to rigid norm-governed sequences such as 2, 4, 6, 8, where we're looking for a single correct answer to the question, what comes next? And for that reason, I don't think an account of how we go on in the guise of having certainty is going to give us a comprehensive account of why we should say 12 after 10 rather than 57 or boo or quack. But I think what Wittgenstein is doing here is unearthing something else, something much more general that all of our practice must take for granted if we're to go on at all. And this, which I'm going to refer to as certainty, is, if you like, what we must have if we're to avoid falling prey to Kripke-style problems in every aspect of our lives. We have to have certainty in the relevant sense to avoid what Blankenberg describes, an all-enveloping lived Kripke-Wittgenstein problem. Now, the theme of confident but indeterminate anticipation certainly spans Wittgenstein's reflections on rule following and on certainty. Importantly, though, what I call having certainty is not just a matter of being able to go on in some specific situation. It's not like the song. It's more general in nature, a kind of overarching sense that the immediate and longer term future will unfold in navigable ways. And only once something like this is in place can anything become established as an unquestioned condition of practice in any domain, as a hinge, if you like. So to have certainty is to be capable of acquiring certainties. Now, to try and flesh this out a bit, let's think about what this kind of expectation actually consists of. According to Wittgenstein, this isn't about propositional thought. It's clearly bodily, practical, and pre-reflective. As he writes, the certainty that I'll be able to go on is comparable to the certainty that the fire will burn me. Now, you might take that to be in tension with what I've just said about certainty being an attitude towards uncertainty, but do keep in mind that the general expectation of being burned can be fulfilled in any number of different, more specific ways. So certainty of this kind needn't involve a fully determinate sense of what's to come. Instead, I suggest what the example of the burn shows us is that certainty involves the absence of any competing pattern of anticipation. For example, the possibilities that one's finger will feel ice cold or that the flame will tickle one slightly just don't appear at all. They don't challenge or disrupt the expectation of being burned. Now, expectation in the relevant sense doesn't seem to require a preceding mental state with a content identical or similar to that of an ensuing experience. So it doesn't depend on some kind of matching process, which underlies the bodily anticipation of harm. Reaching out with the certainty that one will get burned, that's where things stop. There's no reason below it. The chain of reasons has an end, he says. And more generally, we do talk of expecting in all sorts of situations where there are no occurrent thoughts at all. Rather, it seems that the expectation is integral to the unreflective passage of experience, the flow of our experiences. So here he is talking about just sitting there, lighting a match and watching it slowly burn. I watch a slow match burning. In high excitement, I follow the progress of the burning and its approach to the explosive. Actually, a slightly different example. He's not just holding the match and watching it burn, there's an explosive at the end of it. Perhaps I don't think anything at all, or I have a multitude of disconnecting thoughts, but this is certainly a case of expecting. And he also adds that expectations of this kind aren't atomistic in nature. They're embedded in larger situations, larger patterns of expectation. Now, I think a next step, and this is something that I'm still not quite sure how to articulate, is that something else that's common to Wittgenstein's discussion of certainty and rule following is that when we try to look beyond a certain point, we find nothing to support our practice to which we might cling. And I think we can put this, at least in part, in a more specific way. When we experience the fulfillment of an expectation, when something appears as not conflicting with our expectations, if you like, that experience is oddly groundless. It's not determined by the content of a preceding mental state. Now, suppose you anticipate something in a way that's not fully determinate, as we often do. So I'm about to drop a paperclip on my desk. I anticipate it falling, but I didn't anticipate it landing in a particular position. It could have landed anywhere, and a huge range of more specific scenarios would have been consistent with my anticipation. So all manner of events can be experienced as consistent with P, and thus as fulfilling one's expectations. And whether we experience Q as the fulfillment of P doesn't depend on something that's fully contained within P. It's not determined by some pre-established content of P, not specified in advance. We might say there's just the confident anticipation and the subsequent sense that it accords with unfolding events. The sense that it accords with unfolding events, the sense of fulfillment, cannot be inferred, if you like, just by scrutinizing a prior mental state. There's just the sense that it does fulfill one's expectation somehow, that one can keep going in a certain way, that things will fall into place or work out. And let me try and put this in another way. Consider this remark where Wittgenstein says, it is in language that an expectation and its fulfillment make contact. Now, we could read this as indicating that expectation and its fulfillment are essentially linguistic in nature. However, I wonder whether Wittgenstein is instead pointing to an illusion that we're disposed to by language, particularly by written language. So a diachronic, a temporally extended anticipatory process is represented linguistically in a synchronic way, as though everything is wrapped into a moment, contained in the sentence with, I expect that P. So I expect that P conveys the impression of a thought content that's already fully present. When expectations are set out like this, they seem to specify in advance the conditions of their fulfillment. In reality, though, they don't. The temporal structure of anticipation and fulfillment is irreducible. Whether or not we experience, or indeed ought to experience, something as consistent with pre-reflective expectation just isn't fully specified in advance. neither are prescriptions for speech or bodily activity. So at some point in our philosophical digging, we're faced with a groundless, variably determinate practical confidence, which is for the most part unperturbed by the manner in which events unfold. Now, I think similar themes are still at play in the notes published as Uncertainty, written towards the end of Wittgenstein's life. What I've tried to articulate by referring to the having of certainty is clearly not all that Wittgenstein refers to as certainty in this text. I mean, at some points, it just seems that certainty is whatever can't be doubted within a context of shared practice. So I can sensibly doubt as I'm walking to the railway station that my train will arrive on time. Indeed, in the UK, such doubts are well advised. However, doubting that trains exist would in that context amount to what Wittgenstein calls a mental disturbance. It's just not a sensible doubt. But again, I think Wittgenstein has something else in mind as well, something more enveloping and primitive. At one point he writes, "The difficulty is to realize the groundlessness of our believing." And I don't think the point is just that certainty, like rule following, is embedded in our practice in ways that do not and can't depend on anything more. When Wittgenstein refers to groundlessness, I think he's also trying to identify a certain general attitude that we might say is integral to our believing, and indeed all aspects of our linguistic and non-linguistic practice. And it's captured by the second remark on your slide. My life consists in my being content to accept many things. What's this contentment to accept? Well, it's not just a matter of accepting a certain number of things. Instead, I think it takes the form of an overarching attitude towards uncertainty. We're not troubled by uncertainty. We're not troubled by indeterminacy. We have this indeterminate anticipation. And we're content to accept various things as experience unfolds. They don't appear as anomalies. So as I've suggested, even though it sounds initially paradoxical, we might start to think of having certainty as centrally involving a non-localized acceptance of uncertainty. It consists in a sort of default pre-reflective attitude towards life's uncertainties. And it's only with this can anything operate as a certainty for us. Only with this can anything seem secure. To take something as certain is not to feel the itch, not to feel the need to scratch. It involves being untroubled by what remains indeterminate, uncertain, unpredictable. So when Q follows P, expectation P, there need be no fact of the matter over whether Q amounts to the fulfillment of P or whether Q runs contrary to P. What I'm suggesting is this can't be fully specified in advance. So there's a certain flexibility over what appears to us as anomalous and what appears to us as consistent with our anticipation. Crucially, it's a matter of how much uncertainty we're prepared to tolerate. There's no fixed rule here. It's just what we're comfortable with, what we're not troubled by. And if we start thinking of it in these terms, we can really see why having certainty is challenging to identify and articulate, why it caused Wittgenstein such a headache, and why it causes me even more of a headache because I have to engage with Wittgenstein as well. So we're thinking about something that by its nature, pre-reflective, a condition of our thought and practice rather than a contested aspect of our lives. And it's not properly thought of in terms of a particular content of a mental state. Instead, it's a kind of all-enveloping attitude towards life's uncertainties. Importantly as well, it's essentially diachronic in structure. So it can't be identified with anything that's fully present at a specific time. That's what's wrong with talk of funny feelings of certainty and the like. The feeling is fully present. This is something dynamic, something that unfolds. Also, it spans all aspects of theory and practice. Another reason it's hard to pin down is that it can be expressed in all sorts of ways. We can talk about, I can go on, it'll work out, we'll find a way through this, I'll figure it out, there won't be any nasty surprises. All sorts of talk could relate to this. Furthermore, it could equally be referred to in terms of confidence, trust, hope, and also faith, all of which relate in similar ways to how we meet with uncertainty. Now, Wittgenstein isn't very happy with his own characterizations. At one point, he refers to certainty as a form of life, but immediately retracts that, saying it turns out to be badly expressed and probably badly thought as well. Nevertheless, he does at least continue to emphasize the primitive, non-propositional character of certainty. It involves a kind of practical anticipation, something he calls animal, something possessed even by a creature in a primitive state. There's also an indication that certainty, as I've suggested, doesn't concern anything in particular. It's not an attitude with a specific content. It does consist, he says, in a kind of attitude, but it's an attitude without any particular attitudinal content. And it amounts, I want to say, to a maximally general way of anticipating and accepting and tolerating uncertainty. Again, something that's consistent with Wittgenstein's own talk is it's more like knowing one's way about, finding one's way about the place, knowing one's way around a city, than taking something to be the case. So it refers to the fact that much of what happens in our lives is not fully specified in advance. That's inevitably so. And because of this, being able to go on is always, to a larger extent, a matter of how we approach this, how we tolerate it, whether we let uncertainty rest. Now, what I'd like to do very briefly, and in the paper that I'm working on upon which this talk is based, I go into a bit more detail. But I want to briefly suggest that Wittgenstein's approach is complemented by at least certain writings in the phenomenological tradition, more specifically by Husserl's later work and themes that we find actually throughout Merleau-Ponty's writings. And I think we can bring the two together in a mutually informative way. And in particular, I want to suggest to you, we can draw upon a crucial distinction made by Husserl in order to avoid getting drawn into a hideous conceptual muddle over the contrast between certainty and uncertainty. Now, one might shudder here at the thought that, well, Wittgenstein and phenomenologists really aren't natural bedfellows. They're not going to get on, given Wittgenstein's well-known unease about appeals to experience. But so far as I can tell, Wittgenstein never objects to phenomenological talk per se. Instead, some of his remarks could be construed as critical of misconstruing precisely what I have in mind here, in terms of weird synchronic failure with ineffable internal ingredients. Now, to be fair, Wittgenstein does challenge the view that expressions such as "the word is on the tip of my tongue" refer to a special kind of experience. And in so doing, he remarks that having something on the tip of one's tongue is no more an expression of experience than "now I know how to go on." And I want to say in response to that, exactly. But contrary to Wittgenstein, this isn't an invitation to deny that there are any such experiences. I think perhaps he strays off in the wrong direction here. What's needed is a different conception of the relevant feelings. And it's here that work in the phenomenological tradition proves really helpful. So in different ways, both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty developed the view that human experience as a whole consists in organized patterns of anticipation and fulfillment, peppered with occasional doubts and uncertainties. And if we adopt this kind of approach, we can take "I know how to go on" to involve a distinctive kind of experience, a way of anticipating things in general without sliding into unqualified, unhelpful talk of qualia. So let's consider a position that Husserl sets out in various writings, in particular those writings that were brought together and published as the text Experience and Judgment. Now, according to Husserl, all experience involves an intricate dynamic interplay between anticipation and fulfillment. So most often we anticipate things in the guise of certainty. So take, for example, this pen. It's probably not a good example because you can't see the desk below it, but never mind, for me this works. So as the pen drops, I anticipate with certainty that it will fall onto a hard surface and make a noise like the one you've just heard. As I mentioned before, when I dropped a paperclip, this doesn't mean that we anticipate something fully determinate. Rather, one's certainty consists in the fact that there are no competing possibilities. The possibility of the pen stopping here or flying off that way don't arise. Nothing troubles my anticipatory process. That is what it is to be certain. But contrast it, for example, you arrange to meet a friend on a dark, rainy, foggy night. You approach what you think is the silhouette of a human being. You think it's them. But here there remains a competing anticipation, a competing system of anticipation. It could be a stranger, it could be a lamppost. So unlike the falling pen, that situation is characterized by doubt. One possibility is undermined by a conflicting possibility. However, Husserl is clear that doubt and certainty are not simply rival patterns of anticipation, otherwise on a par with each other. Rather, certainty is presupposed by the possibility of doubt. For something to be experienced in the form of doubt, it must stand out as potentially anomalous, and it can only stand out as potentially anomalous relative to something else. And that something else is a largely cohesive pattern of anticipation and fulfillment. Without a more generally organized experience, localized doubts couldn't arise at all. And Husserl here also draws a distinction between what he calls problematic and open forms of uncertainty. Problematic uncertainty involves the sense that things may not turn out as anticipated. So there's a competing pattern of anticipation, which might take the form of a specific doubt. It could be a person, it could be a mannequin, or it could be something less determinate. Maybe this isn't what I take it to be. But open uncertainty is something altogether different. It's ubiquitous. It's just a matter of our expectations being indeterminate. Different scenarios are equally compatible with their fulfillment. And what this helps us with is that we can say having certainty is to be contrasted with problematic uncertainty rather than just uncertainty. It shouldn't be contrasted with open uncertainty at all. In fact, it consists in a general attitude or orientation towards open uncertainty. And if we adopt this distinction, I think it can help us to avoid linguistic confusion over the relationships between certainty and uncertainty, which otherwise make certain claims appear absolutely awful. Like certainty is a way of encountering uncertainty, certainty is the acceptance of uncertainty. And I think those claims are right. Having certainty is only inconsistent with a predominance of problematic uncertainty. And as I've suggested, having certainty is not a specific attitude or the content of any such attitude, regardless of whether we appeal to propositional attitudes, bodily intentionality, anything else that springs to mind. Rather, it's a diffuse form of anticipation that envelops one's attitudes in general. And I think this is nicely captured by Merleau-Ponty, who refers to what Husserl calls certainty, or the sort of basic underlying certainty, as a universal style that all of our experiences and activities are embedded in. And as with the style of a particular person, which is diffuse, dynamic, not attributable to any particular concrete features, the overall structure of experience has a style, a pattern of unfolding that envelops all experience and thought. And I think, and I'd be curious to hear what you make of this, that this complements remarks such as this one from Wittgenstein, that certainty is, as it were, a tone of voice. I mean, again, recall this example of grasping the song all of a sudden and thinking, now I can go on, now I know it. If we can think of that in these terms, we start off with a problematic uncertainty regarding our own activities and abilities. As I try to sing this, I won't know what comes next, or I can't see where to start, or just more generally, I lack a sense that when I begin this, things will unfold in a certain cohesive, unproblematic way. With the arrival of now I know it, with this grasp, with this insight, what we have is certainty, as opposed to problematic uncertainty. However, the two aren't on a par. The now I know it is what characterizes most of our experience, thought, and activity. It's mundane, it's ubiquitous. What makes the case of now I know it stand out with the song is not a phenomenology of knowing it, if you like, it's the transition from one to the other. What stands out is the resolution of problematic uncertainty, the discovery of an unambiguous path to follow, the disappearance of competing paths. But that form of anticipation characterizes our lives more generally. So for Wittgenstein, as for Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, I think, certainty isn't something that we have, but something integral to how we do things in general, something that spans our perceptual experiences, activities, expectations of others, utterances, thoughts, and memories. So I've suggested then that having certainty consists in a non-localized style of anticipation, which amounts to a tolerance of uncertainty. But again, drawing on Husserl, let me put this in a more specific way. We can think of having certainty as a predominance of open uncertainty, as opposed to problematic uncertainty. So as a style of anticipation, it can be contrasted with something more rigid, something that's open to a much narrower range of scenarios. In the latter case, problematic uncertainty would predominate, as scenarios that might have fulfilled a less determinate, more relaxed style of anticipation now take on the form of competing possibilities. So as this contrast makes clear, certainty is actually sustained through a degree and kind of openness to uncertainty. In any particular case of unfolding experience or practical activity, what would constitute fulfillment, continuity, ease, unproblematic flow of experience and thought? This isn't determined in full by the content of prior anticipation. Tolerating uncertainty involves an ongoing sense that one will keep finding one's way. One will be able to go on when presented with new possibilities. So if we're going to talk about bedrock and the like, let's not construe bedrock in terms of solid foundations. As an attitude towards uncertainty, our having certainty consists precisely in an acceptance of our irrevocable lack of any such bedrock, any such foundation. It's a groundless attitude towards uncertainty that operates as a precondition for our taking anything for granted in the guise of a hinge in any domain of practice. Apologies, that was a bit of a mouthful there. So the alternative to having certainty in everyday life is not just however many uncertainties to scratch our heads over. The alternative is disorientation, bewilderment, strangeness, unfamiliarity, all-pervasive anxiety. Even so, a change in the overall style of anticipation could be more pronounced in some areas of one's life than others. You see, even having certainty isn't completely general or undifferentiated. There's a difference between the certainties that one takes for granted in a broad domain and the overall style of anticipation within that domain. And I think, just to venture a rough taxonomy, which we can talk about more if you like, we could maybe distinguish between diffuse disturbances of anticipatory style that relate primarily to one's own bodily processes and their reliability, the efficacy of one's own actions, the ability to act full stop, the surrounding environment, other people, and one's own experiencing or thinking. So there's a nice example in a paper by Javi Corral from back in 2013, where she suggests that serious illness can involve a loss of bodily certainty. In its place, one experiences one's body in terms of a diffuse form of bodily doubt. And she describes this in a range of ways. So loss of faith, a loss of background confidence in the operations of one's own body. At one point, Javi refers to this in terms of a tacit set of beliefs we hold about our bodies. Now that sounds like hinges. However, she also refers to trust that we have in our bodies. And this is different, I think. This is singular. This is what we anticipate from our bodies. And it's better construed in terms of having and losing certainty in my terms. So to put it in a Husserly way, open uncertainty concerning the ongoing operations of one's body is replaced by a preponderance of problematic uncertainty. And this amounts to a radical change in the style of bodily experience, which can percolate through and disrupt other areas of life as well. But I think, consistent with the kind of work that I've been doing for a while now, I want to suggest that losses of certainty can take many different and more specific forms. And these depend in part on the degree to which problematic uncertainty predominates. However, the aspect of our lives that I've sought to identify here by drawing on Wittgenstein and others is also compatible with a host of qualitatively different changes in the overall shape of experience. And these differences depend in part on what is at stake. That is, the kinds of significant possibilities that are disrupted by problematic uncertainty. For example, our possibilities for goal-directed activities could be undermined by a sense of their potential inappropriateness, or maybe their likelihood of failure, or even they appear daunting, seemingly impossible. Whereas possibilities for interpersonal connection might be undermined by the prospect of others' indifference, lack of understanding, betrayal, of one's being ashamed, humiliated, or physically harmed. And our bodily abilities can be undermined by different prospects as well, such as external threats, threats from within, and so forth. Thus, the overall style of anticipation is susceptible to numerous different changes, which incorporate but are not exhausted by an undermining of certainty. So the common theme then is that there's an intolerance of indeterminacy in areas of life where that kind of indeterminacy is just unavoidable. There's nothing we can do about it, nowhere where we can go to hide from it. Uncertainty is an intolerance for this. And what I want to suggest to you then is just that as a general way of thinking about having certainty, this can help us to conceptualize perhaps various philosophical issues, but also to better understand a range of human experiences that involve profound disturbances in something we take for granted, something that's difficult to pin down, but amounts to a kind of general way of doing things. And I think at that point, I will stop and see what you make of this. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This was a very elegant and interesting presentation. We now open the discussion. There are also some participants online. If they want to ask a question, they can raise their virtual hand. We can start from this venue. Okay, so Titus first.
So what do you think? Because from me personally, I feel like certainty comes with scales. So you're making this example of of the paperclip falling on the table. Of course, according to Newtonian laws of hardcore sciences, there's probably uncertainty of which direction it faces when after it's fall on the table. However, according to some of certain quote unquote social science standards, there is a certainty that it will fall on there. So a lot of researchers that I'm from social science department, according to the hardcore sciences they're uncertain, but for us it's acceptable certainty. It comes with degrees, it comes with cross-grainness. And the second is that you say that the feeling of the words coming at the tip of the tongue, how likely do you think that it is a possibility that we actually have that word subconsciously, but we are just consciously not aware of that the word that we realized coming back to our mind? And thirdly, when you talk about psychiatric patients, why do you think that the feeling of, from my understanding, the feeling of alienation, of unassuredness, is a matter of philosophy of probability or philosophy of certainty? Because for me, it feels like it's more about a depersonalization, detachment from reality, than has to do with probabilities and certainties. And that's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a terminological confusion here. So if you look at Wittgenstein, for example, in Uncertainty, he goes to great pains to say that being certain about P is distinct from knowing about P. When you know something, you can come up with various reasons, you can come up with various grounds, but certainties like this is a hand, have a different form, and they operate in our lives in different ways. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that I'm referring to the phenomenology. So if you're thinking about the physics of paperclips and various probabilities, it's maybe certain that it's going to fall down. There may be probabilities about other things and so on. We can appeal to findings in a particular science. When Wittgenstein's talking about certainty, and when I'm talking about it, we're referring to something that is presupposed by the intelligibility of any domain of practice. It's something more basic than that in our lives. So when you're thinking about the physics of things, you're not going to doubt there is an external world. There is a world described by science. In that context, those doubts wouldn't make sense. And when you look at Blankenberg, what's lacking is not the ability to put a tick next to theoretical claims or to endorse scientific hypotheses. Rather, it's a sort of very basic grasp of being able to mean anything by anything, for anything to sound reliable. It's a qualitatively distinct and more basic form of doubt. When it comes to indeterminacy, obviously we have to be a bit careful here, because we can point to cases where we say, yes, we anticipate Q, and we do so on the basis of something that really is quite explicitly stated. Often we do state it in clear words. So I anticipate that within the next hour, at least one car will drive down the street. So it's pretty clear what has to happen to fulfill that. But what I'm looking at is the role of indeterminacy in our practice, as a whole. So I'm suggesting that sort of as you dig down Wittgenstein or Kripke style, ultimately you're confronted with this haziness and with this rather peculiarity where the diachronic structure is irreducible, where really there was no fact of the matter that specified in advance that this should be experienced as the fulfillment of P rather than as running contrary to P. Tip of the tongue phenomenon, or just I know it, but it's not quite there. Again, Wittgenstein describes this in Philosophical Investigations. Sometimes you're right, sometimes the word may be there. There is a right word that you're trying to find. Other cases are a bit strange, though. I had one of these the other day where I thought I found it. And then I realized I hadn't, because I found it again and it was something else. And then I found it a third time and in fact it was something else. So I think there are cases where it's not there. And what Wittgenstein is doing is challenging this picture of some preformed nugget that is waved in front of your cognitive grasp and you keep trying to grab it. Oh no, it's pulled away. So what happens when something is dawning and never quite dawns? Should we think of it as something that's already fully formed and you just can't grab it? Well, to some degree in some cases, but I think Wittgenstein is suggesting a different picture where something coalesces to a degree and then falls apart. It's about varying degrees of determinacy. And I've also been looking at this in the context of our emotional lives, at phenomena such as the sinking in of something, where there's this vaguely specific sense of what's to come, or the emotional dawning of something, or being haunted by things where we don't know quite what they are. So I think what we're pushed to do here is take much more seriously the irreducibly dynamic organization of human experience, thought, and practice, and not to be, as one might say, bewitched by these specific, seemingly convincing but rather localized and often abstract examples.
Thank you. Gary?
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. And I would like to ask, in your presentation, you list a Blankenberg example of a schizophrenia experience that is, what is that missing? It is a lack of natural understanding of what is matter, and it's like something very basic. And I think that you seems to interpret this kind of lack is a certainty, but I'm not sure because from my point of view, if a patient lack of certainty, I think they will have another description or another articulation, probably because they will speak like, I'm not sure, is it my computer exists, or I'm not sure, really sure that there is a God in the world. But they actually, I think in Blankenberg, the symptom is called the lack of natural self-evidence or lack of common sense. It's like a principle or like a sense that everyone knows, and they actually, I think they quite certain that they don't know about this knowledge. So I would like to hear that why you think that this is a lack of certainty. And another question is, you mentioned Husserl and Merleau-Ponty's the invariant experiential structure, and you mentioned the sense of anticipation. And I would wonder, is this related to Husserl analysis of the inner time consciousness and the potential aspects of consciousness? And the third question is, I know that in some schizophrenia patients, they will have an absolute certainty, and they will think everything is like 1 + 1 = 2. And it's really puzzling me why these symptoms appear. So I would like to hear that from your ideas and insight. Thank you.
Okay, there was quite a lot there, so come back to me if there's anything I miss. I mean, with regard to Blankenberg, again, it's important to emphasize that the term certainty is used in a number of different ways. I mean, to make things worse, you look at Wittgenstein's text in the original German, he's using terms like Gewissheit and Sicherheit, which have different connotations. We might think of Gewissheit in terms of theoretical certainties, whereas Sicherheit has connotations of security and safety. But why construe Blankenberg in these terms? If we just take an unqualified use of the term certainty, then it's not obvious that we should. What I'm suggesting is that if we construe certainty in terms of Wittgenstein's discussion, then the two fit together remarkably well. So again, think of the steps. Wittgenstein is preoccupied with some kind of problem concerning rule following. It may be the problem as stated by Kripke. I think it's pretty close. It might be slightly different. But the question is, what basis is there for going on in this way rather than that way, and thus for going on at all? And this can concern specific rules, but it applies more generally. Blankenberg's patients are explicitly saying, the rules are gone. And these aren't rules that were known explicitly. These were rules that were unthinkingly grasped, that were never articulated before. Blankenberg suggests that it begins in the social domain with rules of etiquette. Do I put my knife and fork here? Do I dress like this? Do I say that? Is this the right expression? Is this the right thing to do now? But then it spreads to all aspects of one's life. There's a sense of unfamiliarity and strangeness, which constitutes, just in a very deep sense, not knowing how to go on. And it's something singular, it's something basic, it's something you could go back and refer to as an unacknowledged sense, the common sense. But if so, I think that's precisely what Wittgenstein means by certainty, at least something he gestures towards when he's talking about certainty. This very, very basic way of encountering the world, a sort of non-localized sense of being able to go on. We can call it certainty, he does. We could also refer to the likes of confidence, trust, even faith. As for schizophrenia, I have no particular investment in that diagnosis. I'm not even sure that the diagnostic category should be retained. But let's think about the forms of experience often associated with that diagnosis. You're right that some of these involve a kind of certainty, the peculiar certainty of a delusion. But in fact, I think that's quite consistent with what I've been suggesting, and others have adopted complementary accounts, whereby if you become dislodged from the consensus world by this breakdown of shared certainties, this loss of shared certainties, this ability to engage with others in ways you take for granted, you can become adrift, and in that context, a qualitatively different kind of certainty takes form. Louis Sass has described this in terms of a sort of quasi-solipsism. We also find this right back in Karl Jaspers in General Psychopathology, the idea that delusions involve being cast adrift from the public world. And when one casts adrift, when one is cast adrift, one is cut off from any kind of checking process. So I think that answered your first and your third questions, but can you remind me what the second question was again?
Yes, you're talking about Husserl's work and Merleau-Ponty's work about the structure of and the pattern of experience, and you talk about the sense of anticipation. Is it referring? This remind me to think about the inner time consciousness and the potential aspect of the consciousness. Is it something related to? Yeah.
Yes, it is. So you've got the discussion of horizons, for example. So the idea that when I look at this glass now, the glass as it appears to me offers up a structured system of possibilities for perceptual access, which we can widen to sort of access for goal-directed practical actions and so on. And some, but not all of these possibilities take the form of anticipation. And when we anticipate something, we have a sense of it. We then have a sense of it being fulfilled or non-fulfilled and so on. And this is just what we anticipate. So yes, it's what he describes in terms of protension and retention. It's that kind of dynamic. But crucially, there's all sorts of interesting stuff in this discussion in experience and judgment that goes beyond that. And it takes it forward in a specific way. So what he's trying to do is ground the entire structure of intentionality in the dynamic structure of pre-predicative bodily experience. So he suggests that we don't just have these specific expectations. Expectation as a whole takes this coherent form, which he refers to as a sort of basic underlying certainty. And then within that, you get modalizations, you get problematic uncertainty, you get more localized doubt. You get resolution in favor of the original system. You get revision in light of the competing system, which ripples back and then changes the organization of your expectations, and so on. And he's beginning this very sort of tantalizing project that was never really completed, where you build up the whole structure of experience, thought, and language by starting from this. And all I'm trying to take from him for current purposes is the claim that a dynamic sense of certainty has priority. It's that which is modalized. And also that there's an important distinction between the openness of all experience, thought, and practice, and there being a specific competing system. So it's when protension takes a certain form. There are varying degrees of openness. You know, as one sets out on a journey, one can know exactly what one's going to do today, or one can have a vague idea and it'll all just fall into place. Both can be consistent with anticipation, but that's importantly different from a kind of openness where there is a competing disruptive system of anticipation, where it may go in favor of one or the other. So that's what I take from Husserl for current purposes. But of course, there's a lot more, you know, masses more that one could say here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we have Sabiana.
Hello, Professor. I have two questions on the Carroll's opinion on bodily doubt. The first one is, I remember the sentence was, serious illness sometimes involves a loss of bodily certainty. And the first question is, I'm not sure whether you said the bodily certainty equals to trust in body, or there are different things. If there are different things, what is the difference? And the second question is, I remember you said, according to your view, the losses of certainties perhaps is not limited in this, and it has many different possibilities. And can you help me explain what possibilities they could be? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask you to sort of clarify the second question a bit, but I'll try to answer the first one to begin with. As I said, I think one of the problems with this, with what I've called certainty, is that it is referred to in many different ways, and also different aspects of it are picked up on in different discourses. So we could refer to a trust we have in our bodies, and it would be a non-specific, pre-reflective, I suppose you said bodily trust in our bodies. But I think, you know, we need to be careful about that too. That's different in character from specifically interpersonal trust. But yes, I mean, what we have is a kind of pre-reflective form of expectation that just involves accepting the grumbling and groaning and occasional sort of gripes and little things going wrong with our bodies. We just depend on our bodies. We accept that we can depend on our bodies. But illness can involve this radical, non-specific lack of this reliance, where we're presented constantly with the prospect of something going wrong. So problematic uncertainty predominates. But yeah, we can talk about it in terms of trust. I think in Wittgenstein, the terms overlap. The second question, I didn't quite follow that. Would you mind trying that one again?
Yeah, I remember you said this kind of losses of certainties may have some other different possibilities. As the case of serious illness sometimes involve loss of bodily certainty.
Sorry, again, I wasn't quite sure. So I suggested that bodily doubt could be thought of as a variant of the loss of certainty, where what we lose is a style of anticipation relating specifically to our own bodily processes. And I suggested that we could also look at other contexts where, again, there are these disruptions of style, but they may be focused on something specific. Like think of a profound non-localized loss of confidence in one's own ability to act, or a loss of confidence in the meaningfulness of one's own words. You know, a sense that, you know, everything you say is going to misfire as you say it. So I think there are various different forms that this kind of pervasive uncertainty can take. And I think the other thing I did mention briefly in discussing bodily certainty is that even though it will focus specifically on that domain, it's not going to be neatly circumscribed, because a sense of our own bodies and being able to rely on our own bodies is implicated in other aspects of our lives. So it is going to affect our relations with others, our engagement with the surrounding world, our certainty of being able to do various things, and so on. But I'm not sure whether that answers your question. So if it doesn't, please do follow up on that.
Yes, I think I have more clue about the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, maybe I would like now to I have many questions, but first of all, let me see if I have correctly understood the general move that you would like to do with this reading of Wittgenstein. At least the way in which I see it, it seems to me that like you start from this notion of a hinge and therefore of certainty from Wittgenstein, and you enlarge the scope of this Wittgensteinian concept, and you also transform it into something diachronical as to cover like the experiential aspect of the subject, so that a certainty is now to be intended as this overall style of anticipation, correct? An overall style of anticipation that is aligned to common sense, or to the say the expectations that a rational subject should have given the circumstance, right? So in this sense, I say it's aligned to common sense, because it's an anticipation that takes into account several possibilities which are compatible with the expectations. So if I drop my pen, I do not expect it to fall in one particular place, but my expectation is fulfilled. Also, if something different, something other than exactly following in what point happens, right? But of course, my expectations are rational, because the pen is not expected. There is no possibility that I am contemplating that when I drop the pen will fly away, right? So in this sense, I think I intend it as an expectation that shall be compatible with the shared common sense. And so I would like to have your confirmation about this point first before I ask a question.
Yes, so I'm not trying to sort of expand on the notion of a hinge. I think maybe that little passage in Uncertainty on the hinges staying put when the door swings has been overemphasized, and I think he's talking about hinges as sort of what's presupposed by the intelligibility of a particular domain of practice, or indeed all practices, which we might articulate in albeit questionable ways propositionally. And I'm concerned with something that is, if you like, the ability to take anything as a hinge, a kind of sort of pre-reflective, practical confidence in the overall flow of things in the various domains of one's life. And without that kind of confidence, without the constant, if we were to constantly anticipate problems or competing possibilities in different domains, nothing would, as you say, stand fast for us. So it's a condition of if you like, it's about having the kind of world in which anything can operate as a hinge. When it comes to sort of rationality and probability and things like that, I think it's something more basic. Looking at some of these examples, there's just nothing that specifies what does and does not compete with a particular pattern of anticipation. you can't determine a lot of the case what should and should not be experienced or taken to be an anomaly. And that gives us a kind of flexibility in our experience of anomaly and fulfillment. But another aspect of this as well is nothing rationally dictates how specific a pattern of anticipation should be, or for that matter, how watchful we should be of anomalies. So you could have, I think people actually vary a great deal in these respects, in different aspects of their lives, what they're prepared to tolerate, just drift by, what they're happy to remain in the background, unannounced, what can remain untroublesome, and what stands up and says, no, that was wrong. So I don't think we can get at it in rational terms. I think he's right that there's something more basic than that, a general tolerance for, ambiguity, how things might unfold. And then when you backdate it, when something has happened, whether you experience this as the fulfillment of anticipation or as the negation, there's a lot of leeway here, a lot of openness. So you need this kind of general attitude if the whole of life isn't going to involve these strange anticipated natural disruptions. Sorry, that was a bit vague, but I think this is probably the aspect I'm struggling with the most.
Yeah, because and here is thank you for the clarification. I think now I have I've better understood your attempt, because I was trying to consider the different forms of the different symptoms of mental illnesses at the light of your account, right? So if we consider, for example, paranoid delusions, and I was trying to see how to read those paranoid delusions by considering this style of anticipation, which is contemplating possibilities for the paranoid subject that a non-paranoid subject would not contemplate. Right. So it seems to me that here the capacity of anticipating possibilities, because by anticipating, I think we also more or less implicitly anticipate possibilities. It seems to me that maybe subjects that seem to acquire what in the literature are called irrational beliefs, although this label, I don't like this label, but I mean, what in the literature are called irrational beliefs, right? Because they are against the evidence. I might extend this. They are against evidence by also saying they are in contrast with with the possibilities that usually subjects consider when anticipating something. You know what I mean? So while I'm not anticipating that by opening the door and exiting the room, there will be someone trying to spy on me, the paranoid subject may include that possibility in his anticipation. So this may affect these, I find very fertile account of certainty that you are proposing. But maybe in a good way, you know, because maybe this may also be considered. I like very much this idea of anticipating, of this anticipatory style of anticipation, which takes into account the possibilities that the subject can say, not presuppose, because it's not something that is explicitly thinking about, right? But ready to accept or he allows in his anticipation, so that he will not be disappointed or surprised if something, some kind of event happens.
Yes, I think what you've just said is conducive to the kind of direction I want to take. And more generally, when we turn to psychiatric contexts, and more specifically the kind of phenomenology associated with various psychiatric conditions, more than anything else, I've emphasized the variety here. So in studying depression, for example, I've distinguished several different forms of experience that tend to be lumped together. I think what gets called schizophrenia probably divides up into importantly different ways of experiencing and engaging with the world and other people. And in earlier work, I've referred to what I call existential feelings, which are all manner of qualitatively different changes in the overall structure of reality and belonging. So I would think of this aspect of experience, certainty and uncertainty, as integral to these various orientations, but not exhaustive of it. So it's something that's doing some of the work of understanding in these cases. However, when it comes to specific phenomena like delusions, I'm still sympathetic to the sort of general sort of disposition of phenomenological psychopathology to try to understand seemingly localized anomalies of experience and thought in terms of, if you like, global changes in the structure of experience. So I think you probably can do that with a number of different delusions. One concept that I think is quite useful here and may relate more specifically to what you've just mentioned is hyperreflexivity as set out by Louis Saz. So he takes this to be central to certain forms of schizophrenia, where what it involves is a heightened involuntary attention to aspects of experience and thought that are more usually taken for granted. And this attentiveness is itself disruptive. It itself renders certain aspects of experience and thought problematic. It transforms one's experience. But I think he's not specifically concerned with paranoid delusions there, but I think one could think of some such cases in a similar way, as involving a distinctive shift in what one anticipates from other people, where usually there's a balance, there's a tolerance, there's an openness to certain things, and that openness is restricted such that aspects of life become problematic, and one's engagement with the social world is undermined, but in a non-localized way. You know, the overall unfolding of interpersonal experience and thought are altered.
Thank you very much. We have other questions? Well, thank you very much, Matthew. That was a very fruitful dialogue and discussion. So when you have more work on this topic, please share. If you want to send a letter, or if you have a draft, or when you will publish work on this topic, we will be really happy to read. So
Okay,
it was a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks again for having accepted our invitations. Well, have a nice day ahead. We are now ready to go to...
You too. As I said, thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and it's been a pleasure talking with you all. Have a good evening.
Evening.
Wherever you are, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.